when no man would marry her. Her father chose the strongest slave, 1856 foot. The sun rose slowly over the tobacco fields of Virginia in the summer of 1856, casting long shadows across the land that had seen generations of quiet suffering. Morning came the same way it always had, with birds calling from the trees and enslaved men and women already awake, their bodies sore before the day had even begun. On a modest plantation not far from the James River lived a man named Thomas Whitaker, a landowner of declining fortune and rigid pride. He was not among the wealthiest planters, but he clung fiercely to his reputation, believing that honor and control were the only things keeping his family above ruin. Whitaker had one daughter, Eleanor. She was 21 years old, intelligent, observant, and painfully aware of her place in a world that had already judged her. From childhood, Eleanor had been different. She was not delicate in the way society expected, nor did she possess the effortless charm that men sought in a wife. She spoke her mind too freely, asked too many questions, and carried a seriousness that unsettled visitors. In a society where women were valued primarily for beauty, obedience, and marriage prospects, Eleanor was whispered about. Neighbors called her difficult. Suitors came once or twice, usually at her father's urging, but none stayed. Some found her too quiet, others too opinionated. Over time, the visits stopped entirely. By 1856, the unspoken truth had hardened into cruel certainty. No man in their social circle would marry Eleanor Whitaker. The word was never said directly to her face, but she heard it in the silences, saw it in her father's clenched jaw, and felt it in the way her mother avoided her eyes before illness claimed her life years earlier. Eleanor had learned to live with the weight of being unwanted, but her father could not. To him, her unmarried state was not simply a personal matter. It was an insult, a failure, and a threat to his authority. Thomas Whitaker's fortunes were also failing. The land produced less each year, debts mounted, and creditors circled like vultures. He could not afford to appear weak. A daughter who could not secure a respectable marriage was, in his mind, another sign of decay. Eleanor tried to help where she could, managing household accounts, tending the garden, and reading late into the night by candlelight. Books were her refuge, especially histories and novels that hinted at lives beyond the narrow boundaries imposed on her. But knowledge offered no escape from her father's growing resentment. On the plantation lived an enslaved man named Isaac. He was known among the enslaved community as steady and strong, a man in his late 20s whose physical power was matched by a quiet discipline. He worked the fields from dawn until dusk, his muscles shaped by years of forced labor. The overseer relied on him, and even Whitaker begrudgingly acknowledged Isaac's value. Isaac spoke little, not because he lacked thought, but because words offered him no protection. He had learned that silence was sometimes the safest form of resistance. Isaac had been born into slavery and had known no other life. He remembered his mother only faintly, her voice fading into memory after she was sold south when he was a child. Since then, he had survived by enduring. He watched everything, remembered faces, and carried his pain inward, where no one could reach it. He had noticed Eleanor before, as she sometimes passed the fields on horseback or walked the edge of the property alone. Unlike others, she did not avert her gaze when she saw the enslaved workers. She looked at them with something like recognition, which unsettled him more than cruelty ever could. The idea that would change all their lives did not come suddenly. It formed slowly in Thomas Whitaker's mind, shaped by desperation and entitlement. In his world, enslaved people were property, tools to be used for survival and advantage. Marriage, too, was often a transaction, a means of securing status or stability. As Whitaker weighed his options, a dark logic took hold. If no man of his class would marry Eleanor, then he would decide her fate himself by any means necessary. One evening, after a day of poor news from creditors, Whitaker sat alone with a bottle of whiskey in his thoughts. His daughter's future gnawed at him, merging with his fear of ruin. By night's end, the thought had fully formed. It was radical, unthinkable to polite society, yet entirely possible within the cruel framework of slavery. He would force a union between his daughter and Isaac, the strongest enslaved man on his land. It would be done quietly, outside the gaze of society, framed not as marriage, but as ownership and control. In his twisted reasoning, this act would assert his authority over both of them and erase the shame he felt. When Whitaker told Eleanor of his decision, he did not soften his words. He spoke with cold finality, as though announcing a business arrangement. Eleanor listened in stunned silence, the room spinning around her. At first, she thought she had misunderstood, but as his words sank in, horror and disbelief overwhelmed her. She argued, pleaded, and finally demanded to know how he could even conceive of such a thing. Her father's response was swift and brutal. He reminded her of her dependence, her lack of prospects, and her duty to obey. He told her she was fortunate he had found any solution at all. Eleanor retreated to her room that night, shaking. She had known her father was capable of cruelty, but this went beyond anything she had imagined. She thought of Isaac, a man she barely knew, whose life was already stripped of choice. The idea that her father would use him in this way filled her with shame and dread. She cried until exhaustion claimed her, knowing that in the world she lived in, her refusal would mean nothing. Isaac learned of Whitaker's plan the following day, summoned without explanation to the main house. He stood silently as Whitaker spoke, his words measured and devoid of emotion. Isaac understood immediately that he was being denied even the illusion of choice. The proposal was not an offer. It was a command. His heart pounded, but his face remained still. Years of survival had taught him that visible resistance only invited punishment. When Whitaker finished speaking, Isaac nodded once, his voice barely audible as he answered yes. The arrangement was carried out with grim efficiency. There was no celebration, no witnesses beyond necessity. Eleanor and Isaac were bound together by force, their lives entangled by a system that denied them both autonomy in different ways. Eleanor felt trapped in her own home, her body and future no longer her own. Isaac felt the familiar weight of being used, his humanity reduced once again to utility. Yet within this imposed silence, something unexpected began to grow. Shared suffering created a fragile understanding. In the small moments stolen from watchful eyes, Eleanor and Isaac spoke quietly, cautiously at first. They did not pretend affection or romance, but they recognized each other's pain. Eleanor listened as Isaac spoke of his childhood, of loss and endurance. Isaac listened as Eleanor spoke of loneliness and the suffocating expectations placed upon her. Over time, trust formed, not because they had chosen each other, but because survival demanded it. Eleanor began to see the plantation through Isaac's eyes, understanding the depth of injustice that defined every corner of her world. Isaac, in turn, saw Eleanor not as a symbol of oppression, but as another prisoner of a different kind. Thomas Whitaker believed he had solved his problem. In his mind, order had been restored, but the tension in his household only grew. Eleanor became quieter, more distant. Isaac's strength remained, but his eyes carried a new resolve. Whitaker failed to see that by trying to control everything, he had planted the seeds of his own undoing. As the nation edged closer to war, rumors of abolition and resistance spread like wildfire. The world beyond the plantation was changing, whether Whitaker liked it or not. Eleanor and Isaac began to dream, cautiously, of a future beyond the boundaries imposed on them. They did not know if freedom would come, or when, or at what cost. But in the midst of cruelty and coercion, they found something rare and dangerous: the ability to see each other as human beings. Their story was not one of romance born of choice, but of resilience forged under oppression. It reflected the brutal realities of 1856 America, where power dictated fate and humanity was too often denied. In a society that labeled Eleanor unmarriageable and treated Isaac as property, both were stripped of dignity in different ways. Yet even in that darkness, they discovered that understanding and shared humanity could exist, quietly resisting a system built to destroy it. History would not record their names. Their lives would pass without monuments or recognition. But their story, like countless others, was woven into the fabric of a nation struggling with its conscience. It serves as a reminder that behind every label, every cruel decision, were real people forced to endure the consequences of a broken world. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. To the outside eye, life on the Whitaker plantation appeared unchanged, but beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Eleanor moved through the house like a shadow, performing her duties with mechanical precision. She avoided her father whenever possible, speaking only when spoken to. Thomas Whitaker noticed the change but chose to interpret it as submission. In his mind, resistance had been broken, and silence meant obedience. Isaac returned to the fields each morning as before, his body working under the same sun, his hands blistered by the same labor. Yet something inside him had altered. For the first time in his life, his fate was bound not only to survival, but to another person who shared his captivity in a different form. He was careful, always careful, but his awareness sharpened. He listened more closely to whispers among the enslaved workers, to rumors carried by traders and passing travelers. Words like freedom, abolition, and war drifted through the air, dangerous and intoxicating. At night, when the plantation finally grew quiet, Eleanor and Isaac spoke in hushed voices. Their conversations were not frequent, nor were they long, but they mattered. Eleanor asked questions she had never dared to ask before. She wanted to know what slavery truly meant beyond the walls of her home. Isaac answered honestly, without bitterness but without illusion. He described the auctions, the families torn apart, the constant fear of being sold. Eleanor listened, horrified by how little she had understood, despite living her entire life surrounded by it. In return, Eleanor spoke of her own confinement. She told Isaac about the expectations placed upon her from childhood, about how her worth had always been measured by how well she fit into a role she never chose. She admitted that being called unmarriageable had wounded her more deeply than she had ever allowed herself to acknowledge. Isaac did not interrupt. He simply listened, recognizing pain even when it wore a different face. As weeks turned into months, Thomas Whitaker's situation worsened. His debts did not disappear simply because he had imposed his will at home. Crop yields continued to decline, and creditors became less patient. His temper grew shorter, his drinking heavier. He lashed out at the enslaved workers more frequently, convinced that harsher control would restore order. Instead, resentment thickened like humidity before a storm. Eleanor watched her father unravel with a strange detachment. Part of her still feared him, but another part saw him clearly for the first time, not as an authority figure, but as a deeply flawed man clinging to power as it slipped through his fingers. She realized then that his decision had never truly been about her future. It had been about his pride. One afternoon, a traveling preacher stopped at the plantation. He spoke cautiously, his words layered with implication rather than declaration. He mentioned the growing divide between North and South, the debates raging in Congress, and the belief held by many that slavery could not endure forever. Whitaker dismissed him with visible irritation, but the words lingered. Eleanor saw something flicker in Isaac's eyes when the preacher spoke, something like guarded hope. That night, Eleanor asked Isaac if he believed freedom would ever come. Isaac considered the question carefully before answering. He said he did not know when or how, but he believed that no system built on cruelty could last forever. He had to believe it. Without that belief, survival itself would become unbearable. Their fragile alliance did not go unnoticed forever. The overseer began to watch Isaac more closely, sensing a change he could not name. Thomas Whitaker, too, became suspicious of Eleanor's quiet strength. She no longer argued, but she also no longer broke. Her calm unsettled him. Control was slipping, and he felt it. In the spring of 1857, word reached the plantation that a neighboring estate was being sold off entirely. The owner had fled north, abandoning land and property in the face of mounting pressure. The news sent a ripple of fear through the enslaved community. Sales meant separation. Families whispered late into the night, dreading what might come next. Eleanor overheard her father discussing the possibility of selling several enslaved workers to cover his debts. Isaac's name was among those mentioned. The realization struck her like a blow. If Isaac were sold, he would be gone forever, and she would be left alone under her father's roof, more isolated than ever. For the first time, fear pushed her toward action. She warned Isaac as soon as she could. He absorbed the news with grim composure, though Eleanor could see the tension in his jaw. He had lived with the threat of being sold his entire life, but this time was different. Now, there was something he stood to lose beyond his own suffering. He told Eleanor that if he were sold south, there would be little chance of escape. The thought haunted them both. From that moment on, escape became a possibility neither of them could ignore. It was a dangerous idea, one that could cost them their lives if discovered. Eleanor knew that helping Isaac escape would mean betraying her father and everything she had been taught to obey. Isaac knew that trusting Eleanor required faith in someone raised on the other side of the whip. Yet desperation eroded fear. They planned in fragments, never speaking of everything at once. Eleanor began quietly saving small amounts of money from household funds, coins tucked away where no one would think to look. Isaac memorized routes, listening to stories of others who had tried and failed. He learned which roads to avoid, which rivers could be followed north. The night they chose came without ceremony. A heavy storm rolled in, thunder masking sound and rain blurring tracks. Eleanor packed only what she could carry, her heart pounding as she stepped out of the house that had never truly been her home. Isaac waited at the edge of the fields, his figure barely visible in the darkness. They did not speak when they met. Words felt inadequate. Together, they moved into the night, driven by fear, hope, and a shared refusal to remain where they were. Behind them, the plantation slept, unaware that its fragile order had finally been broken. Their journey was brutal. Hunger, exhaustion, and constant fear accompanied every step. They hid by day and moved by night, trusting instinct more than maps. Eleanor's feet blistered, her strength often failing, but Isaac supported her without complaint. In those moments, the barriers between them dissolved entirely. They were no longer defined by the roles forced upon them, only by their shared struggle to survive. They encountered both kindness and cruelty along the way. Some turned them away in fear, others offered food or shelter without questions. Each act of compassion felt miraculous. Each rejection reminded them how fragile their hope truly was. Whether they reached freedom or were captured along the way is something history did not record. Their names did not appear in newspapers or ledgers. What remains is the truth of their choice. In a world determined to deny them agency, they chose resistance. In a society that reduced them to labels and property, they chose to see each other as human. Their story stands as a quiet testament to the countless lives shaped by injustice, and to the courage it took to defy it, even when the odds were overwhelming. The storm carried them far from the plantation by morning. When the rain finally softened into mist, Eleanor and Isaac hid beneath a cluster of pines, their bodies shaking from cold and exhaustion. For the first time since leaving, they allowed themselves to breathe. The world had not ended. The sky still existed beyond the reach of Thomas Whitaker's authority. They continued north for weeks, guided by fragments of information and the quiet courage of those who dared to help them. An elderly free black man sheltered them in his barn for 2 nights, warning them of patrols along the main roads. A Quaker woman gave Eleanor new shoes and pressed bread into her hands without asking for names. Each small kindness felt like a defiance of the cruel order they had fled. But freedom was never a straight path. Near the border of Maryland, They were forced to hide for days after hearing dogs in the distance. Eleanor learned the weight of silence, the way fear could make even breathing feel dangerous. Isaac learned the burden of responsibility, knowing that every decision he made affected not just himself, but Eleanor as well. In those moments, doubt crept in, yet neither suggested turning back. One night, as they rested beside a narrow river, Eleanor confessed something she had carried since the beginning. She told Isaac she did not know what awaited them, or whether she truly belonged in the world they were trying to reach. Isaac answered with a quiet certainty. He said belonging was not something granted by birth or law, but something claimed through choice. They had already chosen. Crossing into Pennsylvania felt unreal. There was no trumpet, no sudden transformation of a land, just a road, a signpost, and the knowledge that something fundamental had changed. Isaac was no longer legally owned. Eleanor was no longer under her father's roof. Freedom, they discovered, was not a feeling of joy alone, but a strange mix of relief, fear, and responsibility. They settled briefly in a small abolitionist community, where Isaac found work and Eleanor began teaching children to read. Life was still hard, and danger never fully disappeared, but for the first time, their days belonged to them. News from the South reached them slowly. Thomas Whitaker's plantation was eventually seized by creditors. His name faded into obscurity, another man undone by his own cruelty and pride. Eleanor and Isaac did not speak often of the past. They did not need to. It lived quietly within them, shaping who they became. Their bond was not born of romance as stories often tell it, but of shared survival and mutual respect. In a world that had tried to define them by force, they had rewritten themselves through choice. As a nation moved toward war, their lives became part of a larger struggle. They helped others when they could, offering shelter, guidance, and hope. They understood better than most that freedom was fragile and precious, something that had to be protected not just with courage, but with compassion. Remember the battles, the speeches, and the laws. It would rarely remember people like Eleanor and Isaac. Yet their lives were proof that even in the darkest chapters of America's past, there were moments of quiet defiance and humanity. When no man would marry her, and when one man believed he could own them both, they chose something far greater than what was forced upon them. They chose freedom, imperfect and uncertain, but real. Freedom, once reached, did not erase the past. Eleanor learned this slowly, in the quiet moments when memory returned without warning. Sometimes it came in dreams, the sound of her father's voice sharp with command, the weight of his decision pressing down on her chest. Other times it came in daylight, when she watched Isaac working freely for the first time and felt both relief and sorrow intertwine. Freedom had opened the door forward, but it had not closed the door behind them. They lived modestly in the abolitionist settlement, surrounded by people who believed in justice but carried their own scars. Isaac worked long hours, his strength now earning him wages instead of punishment. Yet every night, when his body ached, he remembered how that same strength had once been the reason he was chosen without consent. Eleanor noticed the way he sometimes stared into nothingness, his silence heavier than words. She did not ask him to speak when he could not. She had learned that healing was not something that could be demanded. Eleanor, too, struggled to define herself in this new world. She was no longer her father's daughter in the way she once had been, yet his shadow followed her. In the South, she had been labeled unmarriageable, a failure by society's cruel standards. In the North, she was something else entirely, a woman with no clear place, carrying guilt she could not easily explain. She volunteered to teach children, finding purpose in helping them read words that promised futures different from the past. Still, there were days when she felt undeserving of the freedom she had, knowing how many remained trapped behind. Their bond remained quiet and complex. They did not pretend that what had tied them together was pure or simple. It had been forged in fear, in coercion, in a system that had violated them both. Yet neither could deny that without each other, survival might not have been possible. They shared meals, shared silence, and shared an understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. They were not husband and wife. They were not bound by law or ceremony. What connected them existed outside those definitions. Sometimes, Eleanor wondered what her life might have been if choice had existed from the beginning. She mourned the version of herself that had never been allowed to grow freely. Isaac mourned more quietly, for a childhood stolen, for family lost to auctions and distance, for years that could never be returned. Their griefs were different, but neither was smaller than the other. News from Virginia arrived sporadically. Thomas Whitaker's fall was slow and undignified. The land he had once ruled was stripped from him piece by piece. Former neighbors turned away, and the power he had wielded evaporated when it was no longer backed by ownership. Eleanor felt no triumph in hearing this, only a hollow sadness. Her father had chosen control over compassion, and in doing so, had destroyed not only others, but himself. She did not forgive him, but she released the hope that he would ever understand the harm he had caused. As the years passed, and the nation edged closer to war, danger followed them, even in free states. Fugitive slave laws cast long shadows, and fear returned in different forms. Isaac remained cautious, always alert, knowing that freedom could still be taken from him by men with papers and guns. Eleanor saw this vigilance and felt the weight of her own relative safety. The law that hunted him did not hunt her in the same way. This imbalance haunted her. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside their small home, Eleanor spoke words she had held back for a long time. She told Isaac that she did not believe love could grow where choice had been stolen. What they had was something else, something built from endurance and shared humanity. Isaac listened, then nodded. He said he had never wanted her to feel bound to him by anything other than her own will. In that moment, an unspoken understanding settled between them. Whatever their future held, it would not be shaped by the cruelty of the past. They remained together, not because they had to, but because they chose companionship over isolation. Some bonds, they learned, did not need names to be real. They supported each other through illness, fear, and uncertainty. They watched others come and go, couples marrying, families forming. Occasionally, Eleanor felt a quiet ache at what she might never have. Isaac felt it too, though he rarely admitted it. Yet neither wished to rewrite their story falsely. Truth mattered more than comfort. As war finally broke across the nation, they helped where they could. Isaac assisted newly freed men who arrived broken and disoriented. Eleanor cared for the wounded and taught those who had never held a book. Every life they touched reminded them that their story was not unique. It was one thread among millions, each marked by loss, resilience, and quiet courage. In time, age softened the sharpest edges of pain, but it never erased them. They grew older together, marked by history in ways no record would ever capture. No document would list their bond. No stone would mark what they had survived. Yet their lives stood as living proof of something history often overlooks, that even when dignity is denied, it can still be reclaimed. They were never married. There was no ceremony to bless what had begun in darkness. And perhaps that was fitting. Their connection was never meant to mirror the institutions that had failed them. It was shaped instead by mutual recognition, by the refusal to let cruelty define the end of their story. When Eleanor looked back on her life, she did not measure it by what society had withheld from her, but by what she had chosen to become. When Isaac looked back, he did not count the years stolen, but the moments of freedom he had fought to keep. Together, they carried the weight of a past that could not be undone and the quiet strength of knowing they had not surrendered to it. And in that knowing, there was a sorrow that never fully faded, but also a dignity that no one could ever take away. They were never married by law, never bound by vows spoken in safety or celebration. What tied them together was something far heavier than tradition. It was survival. In a world that denied them choice, they chose dignity. In a time that stripped them of names and rights, they claimed humanity. Their bond was not written in records or witnessed by crowds, but it lived in every step they took toward freedom. And sometimes in the darkest chapters of history, that kind of bond was stronger than any marriage could ever be.